rule, and this year I'm going to be participating in Paddle, Georgia. My Sunday school teacher is making a cedar strip canoe. I went over to check the progress of it the other day, and it's quite the work of art. And I'm going to put the PSC seal right on the side. You know, these politicians, I mean, we just go all out. So I'll be going down the Ogeechee River in a cedar strip canoe. I'm wondering about maybe, about that experience. I'm glad I've got someone to paddle me. You know, I'm going to sit in the front, have him do the paddling, I think. So, yeah, good. Well, maybe I should be paddling and working hard on that. So anyway, come talk with us about the Clean Water Act and because is the comment period still open? Yes. On this? So you'll tell us about that. Yep. All right. Welcome, Kathleen.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. And we're going to take a quick break for water, but don't worry. At the end, I can tie it back to 111D. So I had to rearrange my presentation because when we initially talked about it, I was going to do a survey of what you all in the room and industry had commented on this rule, because comments were supposed to close 3 weeks ago, and I would have had plenty of time to write my presentation. Unfortunately, EPA gave us some more time, and they're now due next Friday. So I'm going to just do a refresher on the proposal, kind of why we're talking about it, what does this weird phrase mean. So it's basically just going to be a refresher prior to the comment deadline instead. Yes. So I'm just going to talk about what are waters of the U.S., kind of the rulemaking history, what the proposal said, and the implications for our industry, essentially. Why did they ask me to come here today? As he said, I'm from Exelon Corporation, and most relevant to what I'm talking about today is we have both generation and transmission. We have several utilities. I think I've got the number up there, but thousands of miles of transmission lines, a lot of generation plants that use a lot of cooling water. So what are waters of the U.S.? And that is actually what EPA is trying to answer at this point. The Clean Water Act from 1972, I would point out, uses the phrase waters of the U.S. to define the scope of the Clean Water Act. For example, the cooling water intake rule that everyone's familiar with, 316B, applies when you are withdrawing enough cooling water from a water of the U.S. So, as that's one example of why what a water of the U.S. means is very important. Several sections of the Clean Water Act, I said, refer to it. It's across the board from the 401 fills to oil spills. Really everything in the Clean Water Act ties back to what is this? What is the scope of the Clean Water Act? Very helpfully undefined by Congress. So there have been several rulemakings and several court decisions as to where the scope of this jurisdiction is. Initially, I'll walk through some court cases. EPA had been going to do guidance, but given all the guidance that has gotten struck down lately, they decided to jump into a full-on rulemaking. And as we'll go, you'll realize that my illustration of the Supreme Court rather than an actual water or wetland was intentional. This is essentially a wrestling match of trying to find a clear legal test for nuanced, on-the-ground, messy realities. I won't read all that to you, don't worry. In general, in 1985, the Supreme Court said that wetlands are, quote, inseparably bound up with waters of the U.S. and upheld EPA's inclusion of wetlands in the waters of the U.S. protection. So that kind of started saying that the scope EPA was looking at was pretty much right. However, in 2001, the Supreme Court struck down one of the tests EPA was using for this connectivity issue. Was the presence of migratory birds. I think a lot of people remember the migratory bird rule. The court said that was not sufficient to demonstrate a link between the feature at issue and the navigable waters. And before EPA could address that, they got the Rapinos decision, which I think everyone has heard of. In this one, basically they said, the question came up, what is a significant nexus? The question at issue in this case was wetlands adjacent to tributaries of traditional navigable waters. So it's essentially one step farther than the Bayview Homes decision, kind of figuring out where that boundary of the jurisdiction is. The Supreme Court ruled Nobody has any idea what they said. There was a plurality opinion and a concurrence, which together found for the Rapinos family. So they won, but everything else got thrown into confusion, because there were two decisions that had 4 votes each, and then Justice Kennedy had a concurring opinion to tack on to as the 5th vote in favor of the plaintiffs. However, that left no majority opinion as to whether EPA's test was generally right and misapplied here. Totally wrong. You shouldn't look at wetlands on tributaries. It was not helpful. But again, it's a legal test for a scientific reality. In general, the key phrases everyone throws around are in the plurality opinion, so that was representing 4 justices. Justice Scalia ruled that waters of the U.S. include relatively permanent standing or flowing bodies of water. Relatively, not defined. In the concurring opinion, Justice Kennedy tried to explain the significant nexus phrase that came out of the Bayview Holmes decision. He said that either alone or in combination with similarly situated lands in the region significantly affect the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of other covered waters. So essentially, if it was important to the functioning of a navigable water, then it would be considered jurisdictional. So after that, that was in 2006, so it's been almost a decade that EPA has been kind of wrestling with case-by-case determinations of what is a wetland, what is a water, is this a tributary, is there a significant nexus of any particular project's effects to a navigable water. Obviously, that's really inefficient, especially from as my perspective, as we're permitting a transmission line or something, we don't need another 6 months wrestling with what a wetland is as we're trying to permit something. So EPA and the Corps in April co-proposed a rule that would attempted to properly define waters of the U.S. to cut down on some of this confusion. They asked the Science Advisory Board for help to try to find a scientific line here. Unfortunately, their report correctly came back that all water is linked and there's no scientific reason to draw a line, but there's obviously legal and practicality reasons that EPA and the Corps have to. So that wasn't very helpful. Anyone who's taken hydrology remembers that all the water's connected, so that's basically what the scientists came back with. So in the proposed rule, a few of the key elements I'll walk through quickly, and then I think the slides will be provided if anybody wants the summaries later. The main ones causing confusion include, in this first one, they attempted to proactively define what are jurisdictional waters. And you can see some of them are obvious. It's interstate waters, territorial seas, that means the ocean, and I think the Great Lakes. But then they start getting a little squishier and harder to apply on the ground. Main ones causing confusion include impoundments of traditional waters of the U.S., tributaries, quote, adjacent, and then this kind of messy catch-all category at the end of other waters that might have a significant nexus. So EPA's intention was that if you fit any of these, especially the first 7, essentially the non-other waters, that then you would know you were in, you had to go through the individual permit process and all that, and then they would just trying to narrow what kind of the individual case-by-case determinations to that other waters category. Unfortunately, a lot of people are struggling with things like what do tributaries mean? And for us in particular, one of the issues we struggle with is the impoundments of a traditional navigable water, because most of our plants predate the Clean Water Act. So we don't know if they were a water of the U.S. when we made that impoundment. So we're doing some archaeology through our records too, which is kind of fun. EPA also tried to proactively define non-jurisdictional waters. Essentially, one of the things they would do is codifying longstanding practices where EPA and the Corps just kind of knew what they weren't going to assert jurisdiction over. They're codifying some of that, some of the exemptions. We personally, and the electric industry in general, remains concerned that some of these exemptions are still unclear. They don't promote the regulatory certainty that EPA is hoping for. For example, waste treatment systems are exempt, but they're not defined. Which, when everyone kind of knew or thought they knew what a wetland or water was, that didn't matter so much. But now you get into the issue of you care which part of your system is considered part of the waste treatment system. I'm not even going to try to use the pointer at this point after watching everyone. But on the illustration, an example is the discharge canal that kind of arches over to the right. Not traditionally part of a waste treatment system as far as, we would define it at the facility. But it, also used to cool the water. And then, what we would consider the water of the U.S., where the permit starts, is, kind of just below it, out of the picture. But if that discharge canal now meets the definition of a tributary to a water of the U.S., our concern is that it's never been considered part of the waste treatment system for paperwork reasons, but it functions like it, and we certainly don't want to have to start putting the thermal sensors in that canal. Some additional of the definitions are just that we're working with the agency to define are, things like neighboring, riparian, and a lot of the definitions are good, they're scientifically sound, but difficult to apply in a regulatory context. Kind of my classic example is floodplain. It's not expressed in the common X-year floodplain that we all are used to from our homeowners insurance, because they're trying to reflect the hydrological complexities, but it pushes toward a case-by-case analysis under the affected programs, which was not what they intended. This is an example where a lot of stakeholders have been trying to get together to propose additional criteria for the floodplain, such as hydric soils, to offer regulatory certainty, as well as more kind of concrete proof of the significant nexus that is more than speculative. So why am I here? Why am I yelling at you about this? There are some fairly significant implications for the electric industry, including, well, as I think Roby described yesterday, he was talking about a discussion of his cross-cutting research. This is definitely a cross-cutting rule. It cuts across many sectors, all parts of our business. There's an interaction with a lot of potential issues, including my favorite, 316B. In some of the initial readings of this rule, we were concerned that after all the work on 316B, that cooling ponds might end up being called a water of the U.S., which would obviously restrict their use for, cooling. So the definition and extent of the waters will affect planning and construction of not only ponds and other sorts of clear water features, but another concern is linear projects with the crossings. If the extent of what is considered a tributary is broadened, then things like pipelines and transmission lines will have more crossings and are more likely to get pulled into the Corps' individual permit process. I see some permitting people flinched at that phrase. So it's like a sweater. Every time I get into this rule more, you keep pulling more threads of the things it affects. Like one of people in our utility I was talking to the other day, and he brought up the issue of laying the fiber optic cable for our smart grid. Would that be affected by this? Yeah, that's definitely a linear project that we don't want to be slowed down. And so it kind of has its fingers in a lot of the other current rulemakings that we've been talking about. Obviously 316B, which was just finalized this summer. The PCBs, there's a potential rule in 2015. Basically, where you spill something, it matters if it's a water of the U.S. or not. Effluent limitation guidelines, I think other people are talking about today. You're subject to them if you're discharging into a water of the U.S. Where's a water of the U.S.? Told you I could get it back to 111D. The final rulemaking expected next year. Obviously, everyone hopes that a big component of that will be expanded utilization of natural gas, which will involve pipelines. Hopefully transmission, running the renewables from where they're generated to where they're needed. Adding a year or two to those permit processes is would really complicate 111D compliance. State RPSs and EERSs, if they're relying on any kind of transmission, or one thing I didn't really focus on was the large land area renewables. A lot of developers in the Southwest are concerned that a lot of intermittent streams that they're not really planning around now might get drawn in that would affect things like solar fields and wind roads. And then the FERC Order 1000 that was just upheld, which is trying to drive transmission investment, and we're concerned that this could hold it back. So, as I said, comments are due next Friday, so you know where I'll be next Friday. The rules of finalization is currently anticipated in 2015. This is one of those rules where EPA has had a lot of opposition and a lot of stakeholders in. They're actually not under a court deadline for this, so we'll see how that goes. The agriculture sector has also been active in, obviously, they've got some concerns, and so they've been active at EPA, as have we. It is a key priority of the EPA Water Office, though, and as I think we all noticed on Tuesday, there's only 2 more years left of this EPA. So it is a key priority at the staff level. And concurrently, the Army Corps is examining the nationwide permits system, so there may be some effort here to coordinate that so that even if the jurisdiction is clarified and expanded, it's combined with clearer exemptions and clearer use of the nationwide permits for these types of important projects. Did I come in under time?
Yeah, perfect. 37 seconds to spare, and actually we have a few minutes for questions. So, questions about water, about rules, about complexity of rules, about not mixing rules. Questions?
Yeah, I get that a lot when I talk about waters of the U.S., the blank stare.
Uh,
I see that hand.
Kristen Jenkins, CH Tom Hill. I had a question related to water quality standards, because usually with once-through cooling water, you don't have to worry about that because you're withdrawing and discharging to the same water body. Have you looked at what would happen if the discharge canal was a water of the U.S., how EPA might regulate that as far as, like low metals limits?
We've kind of broadly looked at it as trying to make sure that that was considered in any definition of waste treatment system so that it wouldn't have to, because you know this even better than I do, but I know that there are lots of times where we'll be monitoring in that discharge canal just because it's really easy to access versus, the edge of the lake or something. So that is definitely one of our concerns is looking at those canals. I don't have a good answer of what will happen.
Other questions on water? I see that hand.
Sam Najum, Oglethorpe Power. Another question is really basic. Retention ponds and detention ponds, everybody's got them at their sites, and they, flow off-site into a creek or tributary or ditch that eventually gets to one of these. So, the spills thing, if you have a spill in that pond now, is that a waters of the U.S.? Do you have to report that spill, even though it's just a retention or detention pond on your property?
Right, and that's one of the things that we are hoping that EPA clarifies is obviously that's a good thing that the retention pond retains the oil before the water of the U.S. And actually one of the complexity in the situation you drew, sorry, I'm from New York, I'm totally going to talk with my hands. So between the retention pond and the water of the U.S., you've got some sort of pathway there. And if that's a water of the U.S., currently the definition of tributary would indicate that kind of, conveyance in the middle there would meet the definition of tributary to a water of the U.S., at which point basically it keeps moving the jurisdiction upstream, which if you're counting on that, spillway or whatever to remove any last bits of sediment or temperature or anything, that's definitely a concern.
Other questions on water? All right, great. Thank you so much.